Hello everyone. It's been a while since I have talked about my application Focus and how it's going, but today I finally have something to share. Recently I gave a presentation called Interoperable Serendipity, and in case you missed it, the basic idea was that we should be making applications that work on the same data with Solid. In that presentation I shared how my first application, Solid Focus, hadn't been the best example of how to do that, and I had started working on improving some of that. So today I want to share how I'm actually doing it. First, let's look at some code. This is an example of a task that was created with the first version of the app, and there are a couple of things that are not ideal. For example, the subject of the task is the ID of the document itself, and this is usually not something you should be doing because the task is not the same as the document. They are separate entities. So this is why most of the time you see things like this when you look at solid documents. Something else that is not ideal is the fact that the only way to tell that this is a task is looking at this, that is using the lifecycle vocabulary, but none of the other properties are using the same vocabulary. So if there is another app that is also working with tasks using this vocabulary, it's very unlikely that they will be able to understand this data, because the only data here with this vocabulary is this. So all the other data should also be using a similar vocabulary. And finally, this is something that maybe is not completely wrong with tasks, but usually you shouldn't have the modified and created timestamps in the same subject as the data you are working with, because in this case it may be fine, as I mentioned, but in my other applications like Media Kraken, for example, the resource itself is the movie, and I have certainly not created the movie, or I am not modifying the movie. What I am creating or modifying is the document or the metadata I have on that document. So it's usually a good idea to have this in a separate resource. We can look at an example of how the tasks look like in the new version of the application, and here you can see that it's fixing those problems. For example, it's already using the different subject. It's also using a couple of vocabularies that I think are more relevant, like schema.org or the iCalendar. And it is actually using terms that are matching the vocabulary used in the class. You will also notice that some of the properties are duplicated. This is actually fine, because if there is another application that only understands schema.org, or one maybe a calendar application that they only understand iCalendar, they would still be able to understand this data. And this is actually something nice that you can learn more about if you read Tim's write-up about the bag of chips, where he explains why it's actually fine to mix multiple vocabularies. So this is what the data would look like. We also have the metadata in a different resource, and we are using the CRDT ontology. Also, this allows me to have then operations to track the history changes, which is how I implement local first in my applications. This all may look a bit abstract, since given that we are only looking at some code and some turtle files. So let's look at the application to see how this actually works in practice. This is the old version of the app. This is what you would see if you were using Focus V1. And you can actually now log in to the same pod to see the same data in the new version of the app. So let's go ahead and do that. Notice that you will have to use a different authentication library, because the old pods, the ones that were working with the old version of Focus, they don't support the new authentication libraries. Okay, so we have logged in, and you will notice that the first thing you see if you are using an old pod is that the application understands that you are using an old version of the data, and is actually suggesting that you should migrate it. Usually I wouldn't recommend doing this, because the idea of interoperability is that applications can work together on the same data, not that you change their data to fit your purposes or your schema. However, in this case, as I have mentioned, there are a couple of things in the previous schema of the application that weren't ideal. So in this case, I think it's a good idea to encourage people to use the new schema. However, you can still continue using the application without doing it, so let's see how that works. You will notice that now, in the new version of the app, we can continue seeing the old version of the the same data as we had in the previous version, right? And what is better than that is that not only can you see it, but you can also interact with it. For example, we have completed this task using the new app, and if we go back to the previous version of the app and we reload, you will see that the data has also been modified here. And everything is actually working two ways. So for example, if I create a task here, you will see, Aerogel. So if we create a new task here, you will notice that whenever we synchronize the data in the new application, it will also appear here. And you can also change other things such as the date or the importance of the task as well. So we do that, and when we go back to the old version of the app, everything works together, and you can see we have updated this as well. So this is the kind of experience I think we should have with solid applications. They should be able to work in the same data, and even though this application was created 5 years ago, it can still work and be compatible with an application that is created today without having to touch the previous application in any way. However, as I mentioned, in this case I would recommend people to migrate the data. So once we migrate it, you will notice that the user experience in the new version of the app is actually the same. So users cannot tell what if you are using legacy schemas or not, and that is the main point of that. But if we go back to the old version of the app and we reload, now you will notice that the data is no longer usable here because we have modified the data. And this is why I say that maybe it's not always the best idea to force users to migrate. In this case, I think it's okay because I am rebuilding the application, so all previous users of Focus, they will be able to use the new version of the app, and nobody should lose any data with that. Now you may be thinking, how hard is it to actually implement all of this? Actually, I'm happy to say it's not very difficult using Aerogel and Soukai. So if we go to the settings modal, which is where I press that migrate button, you will notice that the only thing we are doing with that button is calling the migrate function on the cloud service. This is a service that comes with Aerogel, so it's nothing specific to Focus, and it can be reused in any Aerogel application. What is specific to Focus, of course, is the schemas, and you can see how we have declared them here in this file. So calling the register schema migration, we can say which schema we want to use, which is each model. In this case, we only have the task models, and we have here the schema. And we are telling it that until the data is not being migrated, we want to use the legacy schema. And this single line is what allows us to use the application compatible with the old version of the app. So that is pretty neat. Of course, detecting whether an application is using the legacy schema or not is something specific to each application. So in this case, this is something that is indeed calculated in Solid Focus in the app. And if you want to learn more about this and how this can work and how you can use it in your own applications, you can check the new version of Soukai, which I have been rebuilding recently using new tooling and making sure that it works with the last versions of Node. This has actually been funded by ENELNet, and that's why I have been able to work on this full time for the last couple of months. However, I didn't get a grant for my own project for Aerogel, so I am not sure how much I will be working on this moving on. I will still work on it, but probably not full time. In any case, you can read the documentation for Soukai here, and I have already been using Soukai for a while, and this has been also released for a while. So it's not as unstable as Aerogel, and you can use it with any framework, not only Vue.js. So if you are interested, here you can read the documentation and learn more about it. So yeah, that's mostly everything I wanted to share for today, and I am very close to finishing the rebuild of the application with this, so hopefully the next video you see for me will be the release of the app. Thank you.